Hey, you've reached video presentation number 7 for our English 2170 Introduction to Comics and Graphic Novels class. This one is called Jack Kirby, the King of Comics. The history of superheroes in America is vast, and we don't have time to talk about all the artists and writers who contributed to this genre. I've isolated in our class down to 3 superhero revolutions, what I see as the most significant manifestations of the superheroes in the comic book medium. The first being the 1938 to 1945 Siegel-Schuster superhero boom, initiated by those 2 creators creating Superman and basically launching the genre. Then the 1961 to 1970 superhero revisionism explosion initiated by Stan Lee and Jack Kirby at Marvel Comics, and that's what we'll be talking about this week. And then finally, the 5 years that Alan Moore spends at DC Comics, bringing a kind of formal innovation and subject matter that we've never seen fused to the superhero genre before. And obviously, the central text that we'll be dealing with as we talk about Alan Moore's contribution to the genre in the mid-1980s will be Watchmen. For today, though, I want to focus on the creator who initiated that 1960s Marvel revolution, Jack Kirby. And I've included this still just so that you get a sense of what Jack Kirby looks like. And I also love this still because it shows Jack Kirby as a young badass. And that's part of his contribution to the superhero genre. You see, Jack Kirby grew up in the tenements of New York City in the 1920s, and that was a rough place to grow up. It was full of hungry immigrants, childhood gangs, all kinds of casual violence that one would encounter when going out on the street. And I think this really shaped Kirby as an artist. There's a really funny book called Significant Moments in Comic Book Artists' Lives, where the artist Francois Ayroult kind of extrapolates about how the aesthetic of different important comics artists have been shaped by their upbringing. And his drawing for Jack Kirby, which is reproduced here, is captioned, "Jack Kirby takes a drubbing." And I think it's Jack Kirby's anger at growing up in an environment where a little guy like him had to defend himself constantly from street gangs and from neighborhood bullies and toughs that really influences the kind of explosive violence that you see in Kirby's comics. There is a kind of like anger, there is a kind of seething propensity to violence in Kirby's comics that really give them a kind of juice and a kind of obsession and a kind of power that completely rewrites the superhero genre. Kirby, however, did not begin in comic books. He began in 2 forms that are kind of affiliated with comic books and took advantage of his burgeoning artistic talent. The first was that he worked as an animator, particularly an in-betweener, for the Fleischer Studios, who at that time were producing cartoons featuring the Popeye the Sailor Man. An in-betweener does the grunt work. That is, the main animators draw poses like, Popeye, let's say, for example, getting ready to throw a punch, and then all of a sudden the punch landing. And the in-betweener would have to draw the stills in between, transitioning Popeye from cocking back for the punch and delivering the punch. It was grunt work. Kirby hated it. Only lasted a few months. And then gravitated to work for a nascent newspaper syndicate. That is a company that would hire artists and writers to create comic strips and then distribute those comic strips to newspapers all around the country. He got involved with a syndicate that was kind of dodgy, and so he only did that for a few months as well, creating some superheroes like the Blue Beetle, and also doing one called Sacco the Sea Dog, which was a pretty shameless ripoff of Popeye. None of these were successful, and Jack Kirby's illustration career was off to an inauspicious start. His career really started to take off, however, when he aligned himself, in a collaboration with a man named Joe Simon, who was someone who was really good at placing comic book pages at different publishers, and he also was an artistic hand as well. He could ink Kirby's pencils, he could write stories, and together they collaborated and started their own sweatshop the same way that Eisner did at the beginning of his career. The Simon Kirby sweatshop beginning in 1940 and lasting to 1955, where they would hire other artists and farm out the pages, but that the central creators of the sweatshop and the ones who actually reaped the biggest profit were Simon and Kirby. In early 1941, Simon and Kirby had a huge hit at Marvel, then called Timely or Atlas Comics, in March 1941 with Captain America #1. Captain America and his sidekick Bucky. A huge hit, ridiculously popular, and just a sort of an icon that continues to this day. It started a kind of subgenre of superhero comics focused on characters that were defined as patriots through their costume and through their behavior. One of the interesting things about Captain America #1, however, is that it came out in early 1941, and it shows Captain America slugging Hitler, even though we didn't declare war on Germany until December of 1941. The writing was on the wall in some ways. Hitler was so rapacious about invading Western Europe that sooner or later the United States was going to have to get into the battle. But I also like to think that Simon and Kirby, both of them Jewish, as a matter of fact, Jack Kirby's original name was Yakov Kurtzberg, felt the desire to punch a Nazi, given the rumors that were coming out of Europe about the way in which Hitler was treating Jewish people, and also the naked anti-Semitism in the Aryan propaganda. Simon and Kirby and their sweatshop drew stories for Captain America comics for about the first 10 issues. And then the publisher at that time, a man named Martin Goodman, who we'll talk about a little bit more detail later, caught them moonlighting for other companies and resented that. He wanted Simon and Kirby, who were his most popular artists, to work solely for Marvel, Timely, Atlas. And so he threatened to fire them, and they said, okay, we'll leave. And they decamped to DC Comics, where they had a hit with the kid gang Boy Commandos, teenagers who, under the auspices of a pretty reckless Guardian, fought Hitler and again capitalized on the kind of like anti-Nazi, pro-patriotism vibe that was occurring during World War II. Both were big sellers and both established Simon and Kirby at the top of the comic book trade. One thing that happens in the post-World War II period is that the popularity of superheroes wane. And this is true in the genres and in popular culture in general. That is, there's a heyday for particular genres, and then they're replaced by other genres who offer something new. And Simon and Kirby were often the pioneers who brought those something new into comics. They were the innovators who created romance comics, represented by this kind of spicy splash page, The Savage in Me, from Young Romance #22. And also they did Western comics and other kinds of comics as well. Their collaboration fell apart when they decided to become comics publishers in 1954 by starting their own company called Mainline, just as the entire business, and not just the superhero genre, was sinking. Why was it sinking? Well, partially having to do with the public backlash against comic books. Frederick Wortham's The Seduction of the Innocent was a best-selling book, and a number of parents simply refused to have their kids read comic books, and the circulation for comic books plummeted as this kind of like soft censorship of comics spread throughout American popular culture. And so you had this kind of bad misfortune that Kirby had as he was trying to start his own comic book company, expanding himself as a businessman beyond the sweatshop that he did with Joe Simon. And the comic book company that they started, imploded because all of comic book sales imploded. So in the late 1950s, Kirby, having lost his partner of a decade and a half, was kind of flailing about. He did a comic strip for a couple of years called Sky Masters of the Space Force, which never circulated in too many newspapers, and which was also a sort of legal mess with one of the DC editors who had a stake in Sky Masters, a guy named Jack Schiff. I won't get into the complexities of the Schiff-Kirby difficulties, but needless to say, it meant that Kirby wasn't making the money that he deserved on this strip, and the strip itself imploded. Finally, Kirby returned to Timely, then called Atlas and soon to be called Marvel, a company that exploited various trends. By the late 1950s, they were hanging on by a thread, and they were basically having their most success with kind of stupid monster tales like Beware, for Today the Scarecrow Walks, being published, that were written by Stan Lee and drawn by other hands in the then Atlas and then future Marvel bullpen. The publisher behind Atlas/Marvel Comics was Martin Goodman, a man who had spent his entire life publishing kind of like low-rent magazines and paperback novels and comic books, basically sort of following the trends. He was not an artistic trailblazer. He was a guy who published kind of dodgy magazines and not so great comic books in bulk in order to keep his companies profitable. That didn't always work, and one of the reasons why Timely became Atlas and became Marvel was because he sometimes would try to evade creditors by changing the name of the company. The company itself was called Magazine Management, and at that time, Atlas Comics was just a small part of Magazine Management. The bulk of the stuff that Martin Goodman published through Magazine Management were called men's magazines, which today would sound like something like Playboy magazine or something like that. But rather, they were these kind of like lurid adventure magazines, like the one that's pictured here, which has a caption that might be obscured, unfortunately, by my recording here, where this guy is fighting weasels, and it says, weasels ripped my flesh, which might be a phrase familiar to anybody who's familiar with Frank Zappa. This is inspiration for one of Zappa's Mother of Invention records. But anyways, it's Sin Happy Vacationist, hooked to a killer shark. Can women justify their need for extramarital relations? These kind of like lurid prose stories, not porn, but just spicy enough to sort of entice male readers. And these were the big sellers at Magazine Management in the late 1950s. And comic books were hanging on by a thread. And this is where Jack Kirby thought he was going to end his career. The central writer and editor in Timely's division of comic books was one of Martin Goodman's relatives by marriage, a guy named Stan Lee, who had started working at Atlas Timely as 18-year-old, very early on. As a matter of fact, one of the first things that he published, maybe the first thing that he published at Atlas Timely Comics, was a text story written for Captain America #3, which was drawn, at least in part, by Joe Simon and Jack Kirby. So he knew Kirby. And, this was a tough time. Comic books weren't springing back. Things were difficult. And Stan Lee was kind of limping along. He was getting to be up there, right? He was getting to be an older man. He was in his 30s and kind of burnt out on what he was doing for his relative. As a matter of fact, Stan Lee talks about his career before Jack Kirby, and he did something with Marvel Comics in 1961, and he described his career as being the hackiest hack that ever lived. He acknowledges that the comics that he churned out in the 40s and 50s were hack work, and that he was getting bored. What happened is that his wife, Joni, said he was thinking about quitting comics in the 1960s, and Stan Lee's version of the events is that, the circulation was down, the comics were repetitive, he'd always had dreams of writing the great American novel, and he was spinning his wheels, et cetera, et cetera. And she said, well, if you're going to quit, why don't you do a comic just for yourself? And he did, and that comic was called The Fantastic Four. But first, a brief detail. Before Kirby went to Timely Comics, Atlas Comics, the central artist that had worked with as a collaborator with Stan Lee was a guy named Joe Maneely, who, as you can see here, lived only a short life from 1928 to 1956. In 1956, Maneely fell off a subway platform and was run over by one of the trains at a very young age. And Stan Lee wonders, and fans wonder too, that if Maneely had survived, would he have been the collaborator of the Marvel Universe? It's hard to imagine the Marvel Universe without the beating heart that is Jack Kirby, but Maneely was certainly the most prolific artist and Stan Lee's favorite artist in the 1950s. So what we have is Stan Lee's desire to do a comic for himself before he quits the business. And he collaborates with Jack Kirby, whose work on the monster magazines of the late 1950s at Atlas are popular. And so it's Jack Kirby and Stan Lee who come out in 1961 with Fantastic Four #1, featuring pretty much the reinvention of Marvel Comics as a discrete superhero entity that's very different from the superheroes that have limped along at DC Comics. As soon as you start reading the Fantastic Four, you realize that it's kind of infused with kind of the violence of Kirby's art, and with monsters that you'd never see in the kind of boring Superman or Wonder Woman comics that were being published at DC at the time. Fantastic Four #1 proves to be popular, and so as a result, they launch another book, Kirby said, inspired by Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, called The Incredible Hulk. The Incredible Hulk is not popular, and after 6 issues is discontinued, but reappears and finally reappears in other anthology comics that Marvel puts out in the 1960s, and then eventually gets its own title again. After the success of the Fantastic Four and the qualified success of the Hulk, you have one of their titles, Journey into Mystery, introducing a new character called the Mighty Thor. And then eventually, what Lee and Kirby start to do is they start to pull together superheroes that they've invented. Iron Man was partially invented by Jack Kirby, but actually was drawn primarily by an artist named Don Heck. One character who appears in first the Timely Monster magazines is a guy named Hank Pym, who turns out to be a superhero later as Marvel takes off, called Giant Man, who becomes Ant-Man, the Wasp, all those characters that you associate with the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Once those characters are established by 1963, they pull them together into a super team, just like DC's Legion of Superheroes or Justice League, and call them the Avengers. And it's in the fourth issue, the Avengers, that they bring Jack Kirby created character, not a Stan Lee created character, but a Jack Kirby created character called Captain America into contemporary comics. So this idea of Captain America being asleep for a generation begins here. He's frozen in an iceberg just as he is in the movie, and then he comes back into the real world, into the contemporary world, and realizes that everything that he's known has aged. Although the aging that Chris Evans experiences, he misses, I think it's like 70 years. This Captain America just misses 20. And Captain America proves to be a huge hit with contemporary readers as well. There are other characters that would go on to be introduced by Simon and Kirby, including the X-Men. You get the idea. That is, these characters are wildly popular, wildly different from the DC comics being published at the time, and come along with their own sets of neuroses and personalities that really add an incredible amount of enthusiasm to the superhero genre in the 1960s. An enthusiasm that still continues to this day, with all these characters being published in Marvel Comics, and with billion-dollar movies being based on these characters. What I want to do, though, is talk about in more detail about the textual revolution that happens in about 1964 or 1966, when Jack Kirby really takes the reins on these titles away from Stan Lee, partially because of the Marvel method that gives the artist so much input, and really starts to articulate a point of view about these superheroes, particularly in the pages of the Fantastic Four, where he introduces some of his most important creations. And that's where we'll pick up in class this week. Thanks.